The morning sun painted the Texas sky in shades of orange and gold as David stepped onto his front porch, coffee mug in hand. The steam rose from his cup as he watched his horses graze peacefully in the distance. This was his favorite time of day. The world was quiet except for the gentle lowing of cattle and the rustle of wind through the oak trees that lined his property. 5 years ago, this 15-acre piece of heaven had been nothing more than a dream scribbled on the back of a napkin during his lunch breaks at the construction site. Back then, David was working 12-hour days, saving every dollar he could squeeze from his paycheck. He'd drive past this land on his way home from work, always slowing down to imagine what it could become. The property had been abandoned for years when he first saw it. The old farmhouse was barely standing, with broken windows and a roof that leaked in 3 places. The barn was missing half its siding and weeds grew tall enough to hide a man. Most people would have seen a disaster. David saw potential. He remembered the day he finally had enough saved for a down payment. His hands shook as he signed the papers at the title company. The realtor kept asking if he was sure about taking on such a project. David just smiled. He'd spent 2 tours in Afghanistan and built roads in places where most people wouldn't even want to visit. A rundown ranch in Texas felt like a walk in the park. The first year was brutal. David would finish his regular construction job at 5, grab a quick dinner and work on the ranch until dark. Weekends meant 16-hour days of repairs. He learned to patch roofs, fix plumbing, and rebuild barns through YouTube videos and trial and error. His hands were permanently stained with paint, dirt, and wood stain, but slowly the place transformed. The farmhouse got new windows, a solid roof, and a coat of white paint that made it glow in the evening light. David rebuilt the barn from the ground up, using reclaimed wood he'd salvaged from demolished buildings at his construction sites. He installed modern electrical systems and plumbing, but kept the rustic charm that made the place feel like home. The real magic happened when he brought in his first animals. 3 horses rescued from a nearby shelter that was closing down. David had never owned horses before, but something about these animals called to him. Maybe it was the way they seemed broken when they arrived, just like his property had been. Within months, those horses were running free across his pastures, their coats shining and their spirits restored. Then came the cattle. Just a small herd to start with, but they thrived on his land. David discovered he had a natural talent for animal husbandry. He could spot a sick cow from 100 yards away and knew exactly what each animal needed to stay healthy. His neighbors started asking for advice about their own livestock. The best part about living so far from town was the peace. David's nearest neighbor was almost a mile away, and everyone out here understood the unwritten rules of country living. You minded your own business, helped when someone needed it, and respected each other's property. If someone's cattle wandered onto your land, you called them up and helped round them up. If you saw smoke coming from a neighbor's place, you drove over to make sure everything was okay. David installed solar panels on his barn roof, which cut his electric bills down to almost nothing. He dug a well that provided crystal clear water for both his house and his animals. Every improvement he made increased both the value of his property and his quality of life. Evenings were special out here. David would sit on his porch after finishing the day's work, watching the sunset paint the sky while his animals settled down for the night. Sometimes he'd fire up the grill and cook dinner outside, enjoying the silence broken only by the sounds of nature. No traffic, no sirens, no neighbors arguing through thin walls. He'd made friends with some of the other ranchers in the area. Old-timers who'd been working this land for generations and appreciated that David was doing things the right way. They taught him which feed worked best for cattle in this climate, how to spot good grazing land, and which veterinarians would actually drive out to the middle of nowhere when you needed them. David's construction business was thriving too. Word had spread that he was reliable, honest, and did quality work at fair prices. He was booked solid for months in advance, which meant he could afford to keep improving his ranch. He'd put in over $200,000 in upgrades and improvements, turning his little piece of Texas into something that could be featured in a country living magazine. The farmhouse now had modern appliances, hardwood floors, and a stone fireplace that David had built himself. The barn was equipped with automatic feeding systems and climate control for the animals. His fencing was top-notch, designed to keep his cattle safe while allowing them plenty of room to roam. But the real treasure was the peace of mind. After years of apartment living, dealing with noisy neighbors and landlords who wouldn't fix anything, David finally had a place that was truly his. He could walk his property line every morning, checking on his animals and enjoying the sunrise without seeing another soul if he didn't want to. This was freedom. This was the American dream made real. David had built something with his own two hands, created a life that most people only fantasized about. He was living proof that hard work and determination could still get you somewhere in this world. As he finished his coffee that morning, watching his horses run across the pasture, David couldn't imagine wanting to be anywhere else. This land had given him purpose, peace, and a future. He planned to live here for the rest of his life, maybe even pass it down to the family he hoped to have someday. The morning routine was always the same. Check on the animals, repair anything that needed fixing, and then head off to his construction jobs. Simple, predictable, and exactly the way David liked it. Life was good, and getting better every day. In the distance, he could see storm clouds forming on the horizon. But David wasn't worried about the weather. His buildings were solid, his animals had shelter, and he'd weathered plenty of storms before. What he couldn't see coming was a different kind of storm entirely. One that would challenge everything he'd built and test just how strong his foundation really was. 2 years after David had settled into his perfect ranch life, the sound of heavy machinery broke the morning silence. He stood on his porch, coffee growing cold in his hand, watching bulldozers clear the land just beyond his property line. For weeks, trucks had been rolling past his gate, kicking up dust and making his horses nervous. The developers had arrived. At first, David wasn't too worried. Development was inevitable this close to Austin, and he figured having some neighbors might not be the worst thing in the world. Maybe it would even increase his property value. He watched with mild curiosity as they cleared hundreds of acres and began laying foundations for what looked like a pretty upscale neighborhood. The signs went up before the first house was even finished. Pine Valley Estates, luxury living in the heart of Texas. The marketing materials promised million-dollar homes, a golf course, and all the amenities that wealthy city folks expected when they wanted to play at country living. David chuckled when he read about the authentic rural experience they were advertising. These people had no idea what real country life was like, but as long as they stayed on their side of the fence line, he didn't see any reason they couldn't all get along. The construction phase lasted almost a year. David got used to the constant noise of hammering, the backup beepers on construction vehicles, and the parade of delivery trucks. His animals adapted too, though his horses still spooked occasionally when the bulldozers got particularly loud. Then the residents started moving in. The first few families seemed nice enough. David would wave when he saw them driving past his property, and they'd wave back. One couple even stopped to admire his horses and ask questions about ranch life. They seemed genuinely interested in being good neighbors, but as more houses filled up, the complaints started. It began with phone calls to the county. David only found out about them when a county inspector showed up at his gate one morning, clipboard in hand, and an apologetic expression on his face. "Sorry to bother you, David," Inspector Rodriguez said. They'd known each other for years. "I've got to follow up on some complaints about agricultural odors." "You know how it is," David laughed. "Agricultural odors? You mean the smell of horses and cattle? On a ranch?" I know, but I've got to file a report. Mind if I take a look around?" The inspection was quick and painless. David's operation was clean, well-maintained, and completely legal. Inspector Rodriguez shook his head as he filled out his paperwork. "Between you and me, these city folks don't understand what they signed up for when they moved out here. Your place is cleaner than most suburban backyards." But the complaints didn't stop. If anything, they got worse. David started getting letters from something called the Pine Valley Estates Homeowners Association. The first one was almost polite, asking if he'd consider relocating his barn because it was visible from several home sites and the golf course. David threw the letter in the trash. His barn had been there long before their golf course existed. The second letter was less friendly. It complained about his unsightly agricultural vehicles being visible from the road. They were talking about his pickup truck and tractor, the SA. Vehicles he'd been parking in the same spots for 5 years. By the third letter, they'd dropped any pretense of politeness. The HOA board, led by someone named Patricia Henderson, was demanding he attend a community meeting to discuss ongoing property value concerns. David had never heard of Patricia Henderson. but he was about to get very familiar with her name. The meeting was held in the Pine Valley Clubhouse, a fancy building with marble floors and crystal chandeliers that looked more like a hotel lobby than a community center. David felt underdressed in his work clothes, but he'd come straight from a job site and didn't want to miss the meeting. About 30 residents showed up, most of them looking like they'd never done a day of manual labor in their lives. Patricia Henderson turned out to be a tall woman in an expensive suit who spoke like she was used to getting her way. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for coming," she began, gesturing toward a PowerPoint presentation. "As you know, we have a situation that's affecting all of our property values." David was shocked when the first slide showed an aerial photo of his ranch with big red arrows pointing at his barn, his pastures, and even his house. "This agricultural operation," Patricia continued, saying the words like they left a bad taste in her mouth, "is creating ongoing problems for our community. The odors, the noise from livestock, and the general appearance of the property are not in keeping with Pine Valley's standards." An elderly man in the front row raised his hand. "What exactly are you proposing we do about it?" Patricia smiled, and David didn't like the look in her eyes. "I'm glad you asked. I've been working with our legal team and the county planning department. There may be ways to address this situation through zoning changes and incorporation of surrounding properties into our HOA jurisdiction." David stood up. Every head in the room turned toward him. "Excuse me," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. "I'm David Williams, and that's my ranch you're talking about. I was here long before any of you, and everything I'm doing is completely legal." The room went silent. Patricia Henderson's smile never wavered, but her eyes went cold. "Mr. Williams, thank you for joining us. I'm sure we can work together to find a solution that benefits everyone." "There's no problem to solve," David replied. "I'm running a legal agricultural operation on my own property. You all knew there was a ranch here when you bought your houses." "Actually," Patricia said, opening a thick folder, "that's not entirely accurate. Our research shows this area was never properly zoned for large-scale agricultural operations. There may have been some oversights in the original permitting process." David felt his stomach drop. He'd done everything by the book when he'd set up his ranch, but if they were talking about changing zoning rules retroactively, he could be in serious trouble. The meeting went downhill from there. One after another, Pine Valley residents stood up to complain about David's ranch. The smell when the wind was wrong, the sound of his rooster at dawn, the way his cattle sometimes gathered near the fence line where golfers could see them. One woman, actually, complained that seeing farm animals was traumatic for her children. David left that meeting knowing his peaceful life was about to become a lot more complicated. These people had money, lawyers, and political connections. They'd moved out to the country expecting a sanitized version of rural life, and they weren't going to let one actual rancher spoil their fantasy. The next morning, David found the first violation notice taped to his gate. It cited him for keeping non-conforming livestock in a residential area. The fine was $500, and he had 30 days to remedy the violation. David called his lawyer that afternoon. The news wasn't good. Somehow, while he wasn't paying attention, the county had been convinced to rezone his area and retroactively include his property under the Pine Valley Estates HOA covenant. The legal details were complicated, but the bottom line was simple. He was now subject to their rules. Rules that had been specifically written to make his way of life impossible. As David sat on his porch that evening, watching his horses graze in the fading light, he realized his battle was just beginning. These people thought they could buy their way to whatever they wanted. They thought one man with a ranch couldn't stand up to their money and influence. They were about to learn they'd picked the wrong fight with the wrong person. The violation notices started arriving every week like clockwork. David would walk out to his mailbox and find another certified letter from the Pine Valley Estates HOA, each one finding some new problem with his perfectly legal ranch operation. First, they complained about his horses being too close to the property line. Never mind that his property line was exactly where it had always been, and his horses had every right to graze anywhere, on his own land. Then they decided his pickup truck was a commercial vehicle that violated the covenant because it had his construction company's name painted on the door. The same truck he'd been parking in his driveway for 5 years was suddenly a neighborhood eyesore. Next came complaints about his excessive noise during morning feeding time. Apparently, the sound of David calling his horses for breakfast was disturbing the peaceful ambiance that Pine Valley residents expected. Each violation notice came with a fine. $500 here, $300 there. The amounts were clearly designed to be painful, but not quite worth fighting in court individually. But they were adding up fast. David tried reasoning with them first. He called Patricia Henderson directly and left messages explaining that everything he was doing was the same thing he'd been doing for years before Pine Valley even existed. She never called back. He attended another HOA meeting, this time prepared with documentation proving his ranch was operating under proper permits and had been grandfathered in under the old zoning laws. Patricia listened politely, then informed him that the new covenant superseded any previous arrangements. "Mr. Williams," she said with that same cold smile, "we understand this transition is difficult for you. But Pine Valley Estates has invested millions of dollars in creating a premium community. We simply cannot allow one property to undermine everyone else's investment." The other residents nodded along like she was making perfect sense. David looked around the room at these people who'd moved out to the country and then immediately set about trying to eliminate everything that made it the country. "What exactly do you want me to do?" David asked. "This is my home. This is my livelihood." Patricia exchanged glances with the other board members. "Well, we're not unreasonable people. If you're interested in selling your property, I'm sure we could help you find a buyer." David felt his blood pressure rising. "You want me to sell my ranch because you don't like the smell of horses?" "We want to find a solution that works for everyone," Patricia replied smoothly. "Perhaps your property would be better suited for a different type of development, something more in harmony with the community we're building here." David walked out of that meeting knowing the gloves were coming off. These people weren't interested in compromise or coexistence. They wanted him gone, and they were willing to use every legal trick in the book to make it happen. The harassment escalated over the following months. David would come home from work to find HOA representatives walking around his property, taking pictures and making notes. When he confronted them, they claimed they were conducting compliance inspections as allowed under the covenant. His horses started showing signs of stress from the constant disturbances. His cattle became skittish whenever strangers appeared near the fence line. David began to feel like a prisoner on his own land. The violation notices kept coming. They complained about his manure pile even though it was properly composted and located far from any property lines. They objected to his irrigation system, claiming the sound of sprinklers was excessive. They even tried to fine him for having too many animals, despite the fact that his herd was well within legal limits for agricultural properties. Each fine came with increasingly threatening language about escalating enforcement actions and legal remedies available to the association. David's lawyer was costing him $500 an hour just to read through all the paperwork and explain why each complaint was baseless. But baseless or not, the fines were adding up to thousands of dollars, and fighting each one individually in court would cost even more. The final straw came on a Friday afternoon in late September. David was fixing a broken water pump when he saw a black sedan pull up to his gate. 3 people got out. Patricia Henderson, another HOA board member David recognized from the meetings, and a man in an expensive suit who was obviously their lawyer. They marched up to his front porch like they owned the place. "Mr. Williams," Patricia called out, "we need to speak with you." David wiped his hands on a rag and walked over, his 2 dogs flanking him. He could see the lawyer eyeing the dogs nervously. "What can I do for you folks?" David asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew. Patricia handed him a thick envelope. "This is an official notice of covenant violation and demand for immediate compliance. You have 72 hours to bring your property into full compliance with Pine Valley Estates community standards." David opened the envelope and scanned the document inside. It was 3 pages long and cited virtually. Everything on his property as a violation. His barn, his animals, his vehicles, his fences, even his garden. "This is ridiculous," David said. "You're basically demanding I stop operating a ranch on my own ranch." The lawyer stepped forward. "Mr. Williams, my name is Richard Blackstone, and I represent the Pine Valley Estates Homeowners Association. This notice is completely legal and enforceable under the covenant that now governs your property." "And what happens if I don't comply?" David asked, though he was pretty sure he didn't want to hear the answer. "Daily fines of $1,000 per violation will begin on Monday morning," Blackstone replied. Additionally, the association will pursue all legal remedies available, including forced sale of the property to cover outstanding fines and legal fees. Patricia smiled that cold smile again. As I mentioned before, Mr. Williams, we're prepared to help you find a buyer for your property. I'm sure we can arrange a fair price that would allow you to relocate somewhere more suitable for your lifestyle. David looked at these three people standing on his porch, threatening to take away everything he'd worked for. He thought about the years he'd spent building this place with his own hands, the animals that depended on him, the life he'd created out of nothing but determination and sweat equity. 72 hours, he repeated. 72 hours, Patricia confirmed. I'm sorry it's come to this, but you've left us no choice. David watched them walk back to their car, then looked down at the notice in his hands. Even if he sold every animal and tore down every building, the daily fines would bankrupt him before he could find a buyer for the property. They'd calculated this perfectly. 72 hours wasn't enough time to fight them in court. It wasn't enough time to organize any kind of legal defense. They were counting on him to panic and take whatever offer they made for his land. But as David stood on his porch that afternoon, something interesting happened. Instead of panic, he felt a familiar calm settling over him. It was the same feeling he'd had in Afghanistan when his convoy hit an IED and everyone was screaming. But he could see exactly what needed to be done. These people thought they were dealing with some simple country boy who would roll over the moment they applied real pressure. They thought he'd built this ranch through luck and good timing. They had no idea who they were really dealing with. David walked back into his house and pulled out a box from his closet. Inside were his military records, his engineering certificates, and all the documentation from his construction business. As he spread the papers across his kitchen table, he began to smile. Patricia Henderson and her HOA had just made the biggest mistake of their lives. They'd assumed David was helpless because he chose to live simply. They were about to learn the difference between simple living and simple thinking. David had exactly 72 hours to turn this whole situation around. And he knew exactly where to start. David didn't sleep much that Friday night. While Patricia Henderson and her HOA board probably thought he was panicking about their 72-hour ultimatum, David was doing something they never expected. He was planning their complete defeat. Most people looking at David saw a simple rancher who fixed things with his hands and talked to his animals like they were family. What they missed was the sharp mind behind the humble exterior. David hadn't stumbled into success by accident. Every major decision in his life had been calculated, planned, and executed with military precision. The first thing he did was pull out all his property documents and spread them across his kitchen table. Purchase agreements, survey maps, easement records, and most importantly, the original development plans for Pine Valley Estates. David had learned a long time ago that knowledge was power, and right now he needed all the power he could get. As he studied the paperwork under his kitchen light, David started to smile. The developers of Pine Valley Estates had made several interesting decisions when they designed their luxury community. Decisions that were about to come back and bite them hard. Saturday morning, David drove into town and spent 4 hours at the county courthouse, pulling every document related to Pine Valley Estates and the surrounding area. He paid copying fees for dozens of records, permits, and legal filings. The clerk probably thought he was crazy, but David knew exactly what he was looking for. By Saturday afternoon, he'd found it. Pine Valley Estates had been built on land that had no direct access to the county's water treatment facilities. So the developers had negotiated an easement through David's property, the same property they were now trying to force him to sell. That easement allowed Pine Valley's maintenance crews to drive across David's land to service their water treatment equipment. Even better, the easement agreement had been signed years before the HOA covenant was written, and it contained a clause that David's lawyer had included as standard language. Property owner reserves the right to charge reasonable fees for services provided under this easement. For 3 years, Pine Valley's maintenance trucks had been driving across David's land twice a week, using his private road, wearing down his gravel, and creating dust that settled on his animals. And David had never charged them a penny, because he was a good neighbor. That was about to change. David spent Saturday night and all day Sunday researching comparable fees for private road usage, consulting rates, and right-of-way maintenance. He called in favors with other contractors, asking what they charged for similar services. He pulled up commercial truck access fees for private properties across Texas. By Sunday evening, David had all the ammunition he needed. Monday morning at exactly 8 o'clock, David walked into his lawyer's office with a thick folder and a plan that made the attorney's eyes light up. "David, this is brilliant," the lawyer said after reviewing the documents. "Legally speaking, you've got them dead to rights. The easement predates their covenant, which means their own governing documents can't override it." "How fast can we make this official?" David asked. "I can file the paperwork this morning and have everything recorded by noon. But are you sure you want to do this? They're going to fight back hard." David thought about Patricia Henderson's cold smile and her 72-hour ultimatum. "I'm counting on it." By Monday afternoon, David had legally established the Pine Valley Road Access and Maintenance Company, with himself as the sole proprietor. He'd calculated fair market rates for commercial vehicle access to private property, truck maintenance and cleaning fees, road wear and tear charges, and administrative costs. The fee structure was beautiful in its simplicity. $500 per vehicle, per use of his easement road. Retroactive to the date Pine Valley Estates had first started using his property, and effective immediately, David personally delivered the certified letters to every address in Pine Valley Estates and to the HOA board. Each letter explained the new fee structure and included 3 years of back charges for previous usage. The Pine Valley Estates water treatment facility required maintenance twice per week, 52 weeks per year. That was 104 visits annually, with an average of 2 vehicles per visit, at $500 per vehicle per visit. The HOA suddenly owed David over $100,000 in back fees, and going forward, their weekly maintenance would cost them $2,000 per visit. But David wasn't finished. While he was researching easement law, he'd discovered that Patricia Henderson and her HOA had made several other costly mistakes. The Pine Valley Golf Course had been built partially on what used to be wetlands. The developers had gotten around environmental regulations by promising to maintain a buffer zone of natural habitat along the edges of their property. That buffer zone happened to include the view of David's barn that Patricia kept complaining about. David filed complaints with 3 different state agencies, pointing out that the HOA's attempts to force him to remove his unsightly agricultural buildings would actually violate their own environmental commitments. Any changes to the visual landscape around the golf course could trigger a review of their environmental permits. Then there was the noise issue. Pine Valley residents had been complaining about David's rooster and the sound of his morning feeding routine. So David filed noise complaints against the Pine Valley Golf Course, documenting the hours of operation for their lawnmowers, leaf blowers, and golf carts. Turns out they'd been violating county noise ordinances almost every day for 3 years. David also discovered that several Pine Valley residents had been letting their dogs run loose on his property. He installed trail cameras and documented dozens of trespassing incidents, each one carrying a potential fine of $500 under Texas property law. Tuesday morning, David's phone started ringing. The first call was from Patricia Henderson, and she was not happy. "Mr. Williams, your demands are completely unreasonable. You can't seriously expect us to pay these ridiculous fees." "They're not demands," David replied calmly. "They're legally established rates for commercial use of private property. Your maintenance crews are welcome to find another route to your facilities." "There is no other route. You know perfectly well we need that easement. Then I guess you'll need to pay the fees." The second call was from the HOA's lawyer, threatening legal action. David calmly explained that every fee was legally justified, and that he'd be happy to defend his position in court. He also mentioned that he'd be filing countersuits for harassment, property damage, and violation of his civil rights. The third call was from a Pine Valley resident who'd gotten one of David's trespassing violation notices. Apparently, her prize-winning poodle had been using David's pasture as its personal bathroom for months. By Tuesday afternoon, David's lawyer was fielding calls from 3 different legal firms, all representing various Pine Valley interests, all demanding meetings and negotiations. Wednesday morning brought the breakthrough David had been waiting for. Patricia Henderson called personally and asked if they could work something out. "I thought you gave me 72 hours to sell my ranch," David said. "Perhaps we were hasty," Patricia replied, her voice notably less confident than it had been on Friday. Maybe there's a way for all of us to coexist peacefully. David smiled as he looked out his window at his horses grazing in the morning sun. I'm listening. What would it take to resolve this situation? Hypothetically speaking. David had been preparing for this conversation since Sunday night. He knew exactly what he wanted and exactly what it was worth. First, the HOA drops all violation notices against my property and acknowledges my ranch's grandfathered rights under the original zoning. Second, I want a formal written agreement that my agricultural operations will never be subject to HOA oversight. Third, you pay all my legal fees and the road access fees, Patricia asked. David paused, letting her sweat for a moment. That's a separate business matter. We can discuss a long-term contract at reduced rates if you're interested. There was silence on the other end of the line. David could practically hear Patricia calculating how much this was all going to cost them. We'll need to discuss this with the board, she finally said. Take all the time you need, David replied. The meter's still running on those access fees. As he hung up the phone, David realized he was actually enjoying himself for the first time in months. These people had tried to use their money and influence to bulldoze him out of his home. Instead, they'd accidentally given him the tools to turn their own system against them. The war wasn't over yet, but David could see victory on the horizon. And it was going to be sweet. Thursday morning brought chaos to Pine Valley Estates. David watched from his porch as 2 maintenance trucks approached his gate, then sat there idling for 20 minutes while the drivers made frantic phone calls. They needed to service the water treatment facility, but nobody had authorized paying David's new access fees. Finally, the trucks turned around and drove away. By Thursday afternoon, David's lawyer received the first settlement offer. Patricia Henderson wanted to meet in person. She suggested the Pine Valley Clubhouse, but David insisted on neutral ground. They settled on a conference room at the county courthouse, where all their legal documents were a matter of public record. David arrived early and spread his evidence across the table like he was laying out a winning poker hand. Property surveys, easement agreements, environmental permits, noise ordinance violations, and a detailed accounting of every Pine Valley vehicle that had crossed his land in the past 3 years. Patricia walked in with her lawyer and 2 other HOA board members, all looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. The confident, dismissive attitude from their first meetings was nowhere to be seen. Mr. Williams, Patricia began, attempting to regain some control. We appreciate you taking the time to meet with us. David nodded politely. What did you want to discuss? Patricia's lawyer, the same Richard Blackstone who'd delivered the 72-hour ultimatum, opened a folder. We're prepared to make a very generous offer to resolve this situation. I'm listening, David said. The Pine Valley Estates. HOA is willing to drop all current violation notices against your property and pay your legal fees to date. In exchange, you would agree to reasonable access rates for our maintenance vehicles and withdraw your various complaints with state agencies. David pretended to consider this for a moment. What do you consider reasonable access rates? $50 per vehicle per visit, Blackstone replied. David almost laughed. They were offering to pay him $50 for access that had been worth $500 per vehicle under his legally established rate structure. Even worse, they wanted him to give up all the leverage he'd spent the week building. That's not reasonable, David said simply. Patricia leaned forward. Mr. Williams, surely you can see that we need to find a compromise here. Your current fee structure would cost us over $100,000 annually, just for basic maintenance access. You should have thought about that before you tried to force me to sell my ranch, David replied. The room went quiet. David could see the board members exchanging nervous glances. Perhaps, said another board member, a nervous man named Thompson that David recognized from the meetings, we could discuss a more comprehensive settlement. What did you have in mind? David asked. Thompson opened his own folder. The HOA board has authorized me to offer you $150,000 to resolve all outstanding issues. This would cover road access rights in perpetuity, withdrawal of all complaints, and a mutual non-interference agreement. David sat back in his chair. $150,000 was real money. It would pay off the rest of his ranch, fund some major improvements, and give him a substantial cushion for the future. But it wasn't really about the money anymore. Let me make sure I understand, David said. You want to pay me $150,000 for the same property access that you told me last week I had no right to charge for? Patricia's face flushed. The circumstances have changed. No, David said quietly. The circumstances are exactly the same as they've always been. I own this land. You need to cross it. The only thing that's changed is that you finally understand what that means. David stood up and gathered his papers. Here's my counteroffer. You pay me $200,000. You formally acknowledge my ranch's grandfathered rights under a permanent EA. Saiment. And you agree that no future HOA actions can interfere with my agricultural operations. In exchange, I'll grant you permanent access rights at a reduced rate of $100 per vehicle per visit. $200,000 is outrageous, Blackstone protested. David shrugged. Then don't pay it. Find another way to service your water treatment facility. You know there's no other practical route? Patricia said. That sounds like your problem. Not mine. David headed for the door, then stopped and turned back. You folks wanted to teach me about property values and community standards. Well, you succeeded. I've learned that my property is a lot more valuable than I thought, and your community standards aren't worth much when you're trying to bully your neighbors. He left them sitting in that conference room, probably calculating how much their legal fees were going to cost if this dragged on for months. Friday morning, David got a call from his lawyer. They accepted your terms, all of them? Every single one. $200,000 permanent easement protecting your agricultural rights, and the reduced access fee structure. They want to sign the papers this afternoon. David sat on his porch that afternoon, watching his horses graze while he waited for the settlement documents to be delivered. 3 years of back access fees, plus the $200,000 settlement, plus ongoing revenue from the Pine Valley maintenance contracts. He'd gone from facing bankruptcy to being the most profitable small business owner in the county. But the real victory wasn't the money. When the papers arrived, David read through every page carefully. The language was crystal clear. His ranch was permanently protected from any HOA interference. His agricultural operations were legally grandfathered in perpetuity, and Pine Valley Estates had formally acknowledged his property rights. More importantly, word was already spreading through the local ranching community. David had proven that wealthy developers couldn't just steamroll over property. Owners who knew their rights and were willing to fight for them. Saturday morning brought a steady stream of visitors to David's ranch. Other property owners who'd been getting pressure from various HOAs and development companies wanted to know how he'd done it. David shared his story and his research, helping his neighbors understand their own rights and legal protections. The Pine Valley situation had turned David into an accidental expert on property law and HOA regulations. His construction business was booming with new clients who appreciated working with someone who understood both the legal and practical sides of land use. By Sunday, David had used some of his settlement money to hire a local contractor to build a new sign at his ranch entrance. It was a beautiful piece of carved wood that read Williams Ranch, Estiern 2020, where hard work and fair play still matter. The sign faced directly toward him, the Pine Valley Estates golf course. Monday morning, David was back to his regular routine. Coffee on the porch, checking on his animals and heading off to construction jobs. But now he had something extra. The security of knowing that his land was truly his, protected by legal documents that no future HOA board could overturn. As he watched the sunrise paint his pastures gold, David reflected on what he'd learned. Sometimes bullies picked the wrong target. Sometimes the simple country guy had hidden depths. And sometimes standing up for what's right paid better than anyone expected. David had built his ranch with his own hands, defended it with his own mind, and secured its future with his own determination. The Pine Valley HOA had wanted to teach him about power and money. Instead, they'd learned that true strength came from understanding your rights and having the courage to fight for them. His horses whinnied in the distance, calling him for their morning feed. David smiled, finished his coffee, and walked out to take care of his animals. It was going to be another perfect day on the ranch. In the distance, he could see Pine Valley maintenance trucks approaching his gate, right on schedule and ready to pay their $100 per vehicle for the privilege of crossing his land. David had learned to appreciate the sound of money almost as much as he appreciated the sound of morning silence on his own property. Both were sweeter when you'd fought for them and won.